The cold spoon trembled slightly in Alara's hand, a tiny, rhythmic clinking against the thick ceramic of the soup bowl. Each spoonful was a measured act of preservation, a conscious effort to make the meager meal last as long as possible. The diner, a worn-out place called the Daily Grind, smelled of stale coffee and fried onions, a scent that usually comforted her but today only served to highlight the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Her world had shrunk to the size of this chipped formica table, occupied by a bowl of watery tomato soup, a glass of tap water, and a $10 bill held flat by 5 quarters and 3 dimes. $11.55. It was everything she had to her name until her next paycheck from the university library, which was a bleak and distant 4 days away. She had carefully calculated it. $3 for the soup, a $1 tip for the weary-eyed waitress, and the remaining $7.55 for the bus fare and a loaf of bread that would have to sustain her. Her tattered gray sweater, a relic from a thrift store bin with frayed cuffs and a persistent hole near the elbow, did little to ward off the diner's aggressive air conditioning. She pulled the sleeves down over her hands, a familiar gesture of self-comfort. Beside her bowl, a heavy art history textbook lay open, its pages a sea of incomprehensible theories on post-war neoclassical architecture. She was supposed to be studying for her midterm, but the words swam before her eyes, blurring into meaningless shapes. How could she focus on the structural integrity of European facades when her own life felt so fragile, so close to collapsing? She was 20 years old, a scholarship student at a prestigious university, a fact that felt like a cruel joke every time she had to choose between a textbook and a proper meal. She was living a life of profound contradiction, surrounded by the promise of intellectual wealth while mired in the stark reality of physical poverty. A man sitting alone 3 tables away caught her eye. He was a stark anomaly in the humble diner. While the other patrons were a collection of tired office workers and elderly regulars in faded flannel, he was dressed in a suit so dark and exquisitely tailored it seemed to absorb the light around it. He sat with a ramrod-straight posture, his presence creating a silent, invisible perimeter. He wasn't eating, merely nursing a cup of black coffee, his gaze fixed on something beyond the grimy window. He had an ageless quality. He could have been 30 or 45. His features were sharp and defined, with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. There was a stillness about him, a coiled energy that was both captivating and intimidating. Alara found herself watching him, not out of idle curiosity, but with the trained eye of an art history student. He was like a piece of living sculpture, a study in contrasts, his refined elegance against the diner's grimy backdrop, his serene composure against the clatter and chatter of the lunch rush. He looked completely and utterly alone, yet not in a way that invited pity. It was a self-contained solitude, a deliberate choice. He had finished a full meal earlier, a steak, from what she'd seen, and had been sitting with his empty plate for some time. The waitress, Brenda, a woman with tired lines etched around her eyes, approached his table and quietly placed a small bill holder beside his coffee cup. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his attention never wavering from the world outside the window. Alara returned to her soup, feeling a flush of embarrassment for staring. He was from a different world, a world of steak dinners and tailored suits, a world that had no intersection with her own. Her final spoonful of soup was lukewarm and metallic. She drank the rest of her water, the cold liquid a poor substitute for food, and prepared to face the long afternoon of lectures ahead. The quiet tension began subtly. Alara was counting her money again, arranging the coins into neat stacks, when she noticed the waitress returning to the man's table. Brenda's expression was no longer one of tired indifference. It was laced with confusion and a hint of professional anxiety. The man spoke to her in a voice too low for Alara to hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calm, smooth, and utterly devoid of panic. It was the sound of authority, not apology. The man made a slow, deliberate gesture, patting the pockets of his suit jacket. It wasn't the frantic search of a man who had lost his wallet. It was the methodical confirmation of an unfortunate fact. Brenda lingered for a moment, her brow furrowed, before retreating toward the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned with the manager, a portly, balding man named Arthur, whose perpetually sour expression suggested he'd seen every possible excuse for an unpaid bill. Arthur's voice was not low. "Is there a problem here, sir?" he asked, his arms crossed over his ample stomach. The man in the suit finally turned his attention from the window, his dark eyes meeting the manager's. "There is no problem," he replied, his English perfect but tinged with a subtle accent Alara couldn't place. "There has been a miscalculation on my part. I have neglected to bring my wallet." Arthur's expression soured further. "A miscalculation? Sir, the bill is $37. You ate the steak special. You need to pay for it." Alara's heart began to beat a little faster. She had felt that specific brand of shame before, the hot, creeping humiliation of not having enough. Once, in a grocery store, her debit card had been declined for a $4 carton of milk. The memory of the cashier's impatient sigh and the stares of the people behind her was still a fresh wound. The man in the suit, however, showed no sign of shame. He simply held the manager's gaze with unnerving placidity. "I can assure you, I have the funds. They are simply not on my person. If you would allow me to make a call, one of my associates can rectify the situation." Arthur scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "And how long is that going to take? I'm not running a charity here. You pay, or I call the cops." Simple, the word cops hung in the air, ugly and threatening. The other diners were starting to notice, their conversations faltering as they glanced over. Alara felt a knot tighten in her chest. It was none of her business. He was a wealthy man who had been careless. She was a poor student who couldn't afford to be generous. Her $11.55 represented her survival for the next 4 days. Giving it away would be an act of profound foolishness. It would mean walking the 3 miles home in the biting wind. It would mean an empty stomach tonight, and tomorrow, and the day after. It was illogical, irresponsible, and utterly insane. And yet, she couldn't shake the image of his face. It wasn't the arrogance she expected. It was a deep, profound inconvenience, a quiet embarrassment he was trying to contain beneath a veneer of calm. It was a human moment, stripped of the suit and the expensive haircut. She looked at the crumpled bill and the small pile of coins on her own table. It was so little, yet it was her everything. Her mind screamed at her to just pay for her soup and leave, to walk away. But her heart, that foolish, traitorous organ, felt a pull she couldn't ignore. She thought of all the times a small kindness would have changed her entire day, of all the times she had wished someone, anyone, would see her struggle and offer a hand. With a deep breath that did little to calm her racing pulse, Alara stood up. The legs of her chair scraped against the worn linoleum, the sound unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet diner. All eyes turned to her. The manager's, the waitress's, and his. Sterling's. His dark, unreadable gaze fell upon her, and for a second, she felt her resolve crumble. He seemed to see right through her, past the tattered sweater, and into the nervous, fluttering core of her. She clutched her small hoard of money in her palm, the coins digging into her skin. She walked toward the front counter where Arthur stood, his arms still crossed in a posture of stubborn authority. She kept her eyes fixed on the cash register, avoiding the intense stare of the man she was about to foolishly rescue. "Excuse me," she said, her voice small but clear. I can pay for it." Arthur swiveled his head to look at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pity. "You? Kid, do you know how much it is?" He said $37, she murmured, her cheeks burning. "Yes. I can cover it." She unfurled her hand and placed her entire net worth on the counter. The crumpled $10 bill, the 5 quarters, the 3 dimes. It was a pathetic offering. She suddenly realized it wasn't enough. Panic seized her. "Oh," she stammered, her mind racing. "My soup, it was $3. I don't have enough for both." A wave of mortification washed over her. Here she was, trying to perform some grand gesture of kindness, and she couldn't even afford it. The situation had shifted from embarrassing for him to humiliating for her. But before she could retract her offer and slink away, The man spoke from his table. "Her soup will be on my bill." His voice was still quiet, but it commanded the attention of the entire room. He rose from his seat and walked to the counter, his movements fluid and economical. He was taller than she had realized, and standing this close, she could smell a faint, clean scent of sandalwood and something else she couldn't name. He stood beside her, a silent, imposing presence. He did not look at her, but addressed the manager. "The young lady is covering my meal. Add her soup to the total. I will owe her $40. Arthur looked from the man's impassive face to Alara's flushed one, and finally, with a shrug, he began to process the payment. Alara wanted to evaporate. She pushed her money forward. "I only have $11.55, she whispered, her voice choked with embarrassment. The man, Sterling, simply nodded. "Then I will owe you $11.55, he looked at Arthur. "The remainder will be settled." Arthur, seemingly decided that this was too strange a situation to argue with, simply grunted and took her money. He punched a few buttons on the register and the transaction was over. The immediate crisis was resolved, but a new one had just begun for Alara. She had nothing left. No money for the bus, no money for bread, no money for anything. She turned away from the counter, grabbing her worn backpack from her table. She shoved her heavy textbook inside, her hands trembling. She had to get out of there before the full weight of her decision crushed her. She could feel his eyes on her back as she moved toward the exit. The diner door, with its little bell that was supposed to jingle cheerfully, felt like the portal to a very bleak few days. Just as her hand touched the cool metal of the door handle, his voice stopped her. "Wait," she paused, her back still to him, unable to face him. "You did not have to do that," he said. "It was a simple statement of fact." "It's okay," she mumbled toward the door. "Everyone has a bad day." She pushed the door open, desperate for the anonymity of the bustling street. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice closer now. She risked a fleeting glance over her shoulder. He was standing just a few feet away, his expression serious, intense. "Alara," she breathed, and then she was gone, slipping out into the cold afternoon air, the little bell marking her escape. The wind whipped at her face, a harsh reminder of the long walk ahead. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. She had acted on an impulse of compassion, and now she would have to pay the price. The next few days were a lesson in austerity. Alara walked the 3 miles to and from campus, her worn-out sneakers offering little protection against the hard pavement. The walk home, in particular, was punishing as the early autumn evenings grew colder and darker. Her diet consisted of the last 2 packets of instant ramen she had in her cupboard and countless glasses of water to trick her stomach into feeling full. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull ache that made it even harder to concentrate on her lectures. The memory of the diner, of the man in the suit, felt like a strange fever dream. She found herself oscillating between a sense of quiet pride in her action and a wave of deep, pragmatic regret. She had helped a stranger, yes, but she had jeopardized her own well-being in the process. Was it nobility or foolishness? She couldn't decide. On the 3rd day, she was in her sanctuary, the university library. The towering shelves, the scent of old paper and binding glue, the profound silence. It was the one place where she felt a sense of peace. Her job was simple: reshelve books. It was mindless, solitary work that allowed her thoughts to wander. She was pushing a squeaky cart through the deserted history section in the library's sub-basement, a place few students ever ventured. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. As she reached for a heavy tome on Byzantine art, a voice cut through the silence, low and familiar. "Alara," she froze, her hand hovering in midair. Her heart leaped into her throat. She slowly turned. At the end of the long, narrow aisle, flanked by shadows, stood Sterling. He wasn't wearing the sharp suit from the diner. Instead, he was dressed in dark trousers and a simple black cashmere sweater that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. He looked less like a businessman and more like a predator in its natural habitat, silent, watchful, and perfectly at ease in the shadows. 2 other men, large and impassive, stood discreetly a few aisles down, their presence a silent testament to his importance. How did you find me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The cart of books felt like a flimsy shield between them. He took a slow step forward, his expensive shoes making no sound on the polished concrete floor. "Your name is not a common one. And you are carrying a textbook from this university," he explained, as if it were the simplest puzzle in the world. It was not difficult to find a student of art history named Alara. He stopped a respectable distance from her, but his presence seemed to suck all the air from the aisle. "I came to repay my debt." He held out a crisp, white envelope. It was thick, and she could see the edges of $100 bills through the paper. She stared at the envelope, then back at his unreadable face. The desperate, hungry part of her screamed to take it. It would solve all her problems. It would mean food, a new sweater, maybe even a new pair of shoes without holes in the soles. But another part of her, the part that had paid for his meal in the first place, recoiled. "No," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "That's not necessary. I didn't do it for a reward." He didn't seem surprised or offended. He simply lowered his hand, his gaze never leaving her face. "I am aware," he said softly. "Kindness, without expectation, is a rare commodity. It should not go unrewarded. On the contrary, it should be protected." His choice of words was peculiar, almost formal. The way he said "protected" sent a small shiver down her spine. It hinted at a world where kindness was a vulnerability, something that needed guarding. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. She could feel the weight of his stare, a gaze that seemed to assess and understand her in a way that left her feeling completely exposed. Alara clutched the edge of the metal bookshelf, the cold steel grounding her. "I can't accept that," she repeated, shaking her head. "It wouldn't feel right." A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, or respect, danced in Sterling's dark eyes. A corner of his mouth tilted upwards in a ghost of a smile. "Your principles are a fortress," he observed. "This is also rare." He tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of his sweater and changed his approach. "The money is merely a transaction, a debt settled. It is a matter of honor for me. But I have another proposal for you. One that is not a gift, but an opportunity." His gaze sharpened. "I have learned that you are a student of art history, and that you are facing financial difficulties." The polite euphemism for her poverty stung, but she couldn't deny its truth. She was stunned by how much he knew about her. It was unsettling. "Who are you?" she asked, the question she had been holding back since he first appeared at the end of the aisle. He ignored the question, his focus unwavering. "I am a private collector. I acquire items of historical and artistic significance. My collection is extensive, and I require a research assistant. Someone with a discerning eye for authenticity, a deep understanding of history, and, most importantly, absolute discretion." The offer hung in the silent, dusty air between them, shimmering with impossibility. It was the kind of job she dreamed about, the kind of opportunity that didn't exist for students like her, students who had to work menial jobs just to survive. "The position would involve cataloging my current collection, researching potential acquisitions, and occasionally accompanying me to auctions and private viewings. The salary," he paused, his eyes holding hers, "would be substantial. It would eliminate your financial difficulties entirely." It was a lifeline. It was a fantasy. And it was being offered by a complete stranger who had found her in the basement of a library. "Why me?" she managed to ask, her voice a fragile whisper. "There are hundreds of art students here." He took another step closer, and the space between them shrank. "Because in that diner," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost intimate tone, "you showed compassion when you had nothing to gain. And just now, you showed integrity when you had everything to lose. In my world, Alara, that kind of character is rarer and far more valuable than any Rembrandt or Ming vase." His world, the word resonated with unspoken meaning, hinting at a place far removed from academia and dusty books. It was a world where character was currency, and where a man like him needed people he could trust implicitly. Alara accepted. She had no other choice. To refuse would be to condemn herself to a future of constant struggle, of choosing between hunger and education. Her life transformed with a speed that left her breathless. One day she was living in a cramped, drafty room with a hot plate and a shared bathroom. The next, she was signing a lease on a beautiful, light-filled studio apartment in a safe neighborhood, the first and last month's rent paid for by in advance on her salary. The constant, gnawing anxiety about money evaporated, replaced by a sense of bewildered gratitude. Her work was not in some corporate office, but in Sterling's private gallery, a breathtaking space that occupied the entire top floor of a sleek, unmarked skyscraper downtown. The gallery was a marvel of minimalist design, with white walls, polished concrete floors, and state-of-the-art lighting that made each piece of art feel like a sacred object. The collection itself was eclectic and priceless, ranging from ancient Korean celadon pottery to bold, abstract canvases by modern masters. It was a paradise for an art historian. She began to learn about Sterling not from what he said, but from what he surrounded himself with. Each piece had a story, and he knew them all intimately. He was a man of deep culture and refined taste, a stark contrast to the thuggish image his quiet authority might suggest. He was patient with her, guiding her through the collection, sharing his knowledge freely. And he listened. When she offered an opinion or a fresh perspective on a piece, he would listen with a focused intensity that made her feel seen and valued. The soft romance between them began not with a grand gesture, but in these small, quiet moments. It was in the way his eyes would linger on her face a moment too long after she finished speaking, or the way he would find an excuse to stand a little closer to her as they examined a painting. One evening, they were working late, cataloging a new acquisition, a magnificent 17th-century Korean moon jar. Its surface was a milky white, marked by subtle imperfections and cracks from the firing process. "The imperfections are its history," he said, his voice a low murmur beside her. He gently traced a fine crack with his finger. "They do not diminish its beauty. They prove that it has survived. They give it a soul." He looked up from the jar and met her gaze. In that moment, Alara felt he was no longer talking about pottery. She felt he was talking about her, about the frayed cuffs of her old gray sweater, about the struggles that had marked her. A few days later, a long, flat box from a high-end boutique was delivered to her apartment. Inside was a cashmere scarf in a soft shade of charcoal gray, impossibly warm and luxurious. There was no note, but she knew it was from him. It was a silent, thoughtful gesture that spoke volumes, a gentle replacement for the threadbare comfort she had clung to for so long. She started to see the man behind the mystery, the quiet solitude, the immense power. She saw a man who valued beauty, strength, and survival, in both his art and in the people he chose to have around him. And she found herself, much to her own surprise, falling for him. A year slipped by, transforming Alara in ways she could never have imagined. The timid, perpetually worried student was gone, replaced by a confident young woman who could expertly negotiate with art dealers and speak with authority on the nuances of Italian Renaissance brushwork. She was on track to graduate with the highest honors, her tuition no longer a source of crippling debt but a simple, settled expense. Her relationship with Sterling had deepened into a complex tapestry of professional respect, genuine friendship, and a powerful, unspoken emotional current that flowed between them. The strict lines of employer and employee had long since blurred. They now shared quiet dinners in the gallery after the staff had gone home, surrounded by silent masterpieces, discussing everything from art and philosophy to their own carefully guarded pasts. He never spoke directly about the darker side of his business, but she was not blind. She pieced it together from the fragments she observed, the hushed, urgent phone calls in Korean, the deferential fear in the eyes of men who came to meet with him, the way his bodyguards, Vance and Silas, moved with a lethal grace. She knew he was a dangerous man, that his wealth and power were likely built on a foundation she would rather not examine too closely. Yet, the man she knew was the one who remembered she loved the scent of lavender and had a small vase of it placed on her desk each week. The man she knew was the one whose rare, genuine smile was reserved only for her, a sudden, brilliant flash of light in his otherwise serious demeanor. He was a man of profound contradictions, and she found herself drawn to every single one of them. One cool autumn night, they were standing on the terrace of his penthouse, which was situated directly above the gallery. The city sprawled below them, a glittering carpet of a million lights. The wind was gentle, carrying the distant sound of sirens. He had been quiet for a long time, staring out at the skyline. "My world is a complicated one, Elara," he said suddenly, his voice low against the vastness of the night. "It is often a dark place, built on rules you would not understand." She turned to face him, the city lights reflecting like stars in her eyes. She was no longer intimidated by him, no longer the frightened girl from the diner. She saw him clearly now, a powerful man, a lonely man, a man who had shown her more kindness than anyone else in her life. "You brought light into mine, Sterling," she said softly, using his first name in a way that felt both daring and perfectly natural. He turned to her, his expression softening in the dim light. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "You were always the light. I just gave you a place where you were safe enough to shine." He leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. He pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not passionate or demanding, but it was filled with the weight of a year of unspoken feelings. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect, of a deep and profound connection that transcended their different worlds. It was the quiet, inevitable culmination of a single act of kindness in a rundown diner, a promise of a future she had never dared to dream of. 3 years later, Elara stood at the entrance of a newly inaugurated gallery, not as an assistant, but as its director. The Sterling Foundation, which she now managed, had become one of an influential force in the art world, not for its acquisitions, but for its philanthropy. Under her guidance, its primary mission was to fund scholarships and provide opportunities for underprivileged art students from backgrounds like her own. Tonight was the opening of a special exhibition showcasing the work of the Foundation's first scholarship recipient, a talented young painter from the city's poorest neighborhood. The gallery was buzzing with a sophisticated crowd of critics, collectors, and patrons, but Elara's attention was fixed on the young artist. The girl, a brilliant painter named Jordan, was standing before her largest canvas, looking overwhelmed and awestruck. She was wearing a simple, slightly faded sweater, and the sight sent a jolt of memory through Elara, so potent it was almost dizzying. She remembered the feeling of that tattered gray fabric, the chill of a world that felt cold and indifferent. She saw her former self in the young artist's eyes, the same mixture of fierce ambition, raw talent, and gnawing insecurity. A warm hand settled on the small of her back, a familiar, grounding touch. Sterling moved to stand beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but to her, he was just the man who saw her when no one else did. He followed her gaze to the young artist. "You have given her a world of opportunity," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "You've changed her life." Elara leaned her head against a shoulder, a gesture of easy intimacy that spoke of years of shared trust and affection. The city lights twinkled through the gallery's large windows, a familiar backdrop to their life together. "No," she whispered, a soft smile playing on her lips. A bowl of soup changed her life. Sterling turned his head, his cheek brushing against her hair. He understood completely. He knew that this gallery, this foundation, this entire evening was the final, beautiful ripple spreading from a single, impulsive act of compassion. It was the legacy of $11.55, given freely by a girl who had nothing, to a man who had everything but couldn't find his wallet. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people from impossibly different worlds, now intertwined as one. They watched as a wealthy collector approached the young artist, his checkbook already in hand. They were witnessing the beginning of another life transformed. Elara closed her eyes for a moment, a wave of profound gratitude washing over her. She had learned that kindness was not a transaction, it was a force of nature. It was a seed that, when planted in the unlikeliest of soil, could grow into a forest of possibilities. Her small act of charity in a greasy spoon diner had not been an end, but a beginning. It was not a simple payment for a stranger's meal. It was an investment in destiny, his, the young artist's, and most unexpectedly of all, her own. It was a thread of fate, pulled by a girl in a tattered gray sweater, that had unraveled a life of hardship and woven a masterpiece of purpose, hope, and love.